The words cut through the spring air like glass shards, each syllable deliberate and cold. "Mom, Dad, you're not invited. This is my day. Please leave." Margaret Wilson stood frozen in the marble foyer of Riverside Gardens, the most exclusive venue in Lakewood, Colorado. Her hands trembled as she clutched the silver-wrapped gift box behind her back. Inside lay her mother's pearl necklace, worn by 3 generations of Wilson women on their wedding days. The same necklace her daughter Emma had once admired as a child, spinning before the bedroom mirror, declaring, "I want this when I get married, Mommy." Richard's face drained of color beside her, his freshly pressed charcoal suit suddenly feeling like armor that offered no protection. The venue coordinator, a polished woman in her 30s, shifted uncomfortably, her practiced smile faltering as she witnessed the scene unfolding. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the string quartet, tuning their instruments in the garden beyond. "We arranged everything. We paid, and I appreciate that," Emma interrupted, her tone as flat as if she were declining a dinner. "But this is what Justin and I want. His family has certain expectations about the kind of wedding this should be." Behind Emma, the bridal suite door remained ajar, revealing glimpses of blue silk. The bridesmaids, Margaret realized, listening to every word. She caught sight of her daughter in the ornate mirror, resplendent in a gown that wasn't the one they'd chosen together months ago. This dress was different, more elaborate, with intricate beadwork that must have cost thousands more than their original selection. "Olivia," Richard found his voice, hoarse with disbelief, "we're your parents. I know who you are," Emma said, stepping into the hallway and pulling the door closed behind her with a soft click. "But today isn't about you or what you've paid for. It's about Justin and me starting our life together." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, as if she were standing on a ship in rough waters. Around them, wedding guests moved through the venue with champagne glasses and expectant smiles. None of them knew that the parents of the bride were being asked to leave their own daughter's wedding, the wedding they had financed entirely with Richard's retirement savings. "There must be some misunderstanding," Margaret tried again, her teacher's voice, the one that had guided kindergartners for 30 years, emerging despite her shock. "The invitations had our names. We've been planning this together for 8 months. Emma's eyes flicked the box, but she didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "Your great-grandmother's pearl necklace. The one you always admired when you were little. Every Wilson woman has worn it on her wedding day." Margaret's voice carried the weight of tradition, of love passed down through generations. For a moment, something flickered in Emma's eyes, a shadow of the little girl who used to play dress-up with Margaret's jewelry, who would stand on tiptoe to see herself in the bedroom mirror wearing grown-up accessories. But then it was gone, replaced by something harder. "That's sweet, Mom, but I've already chosen my jewelry for today." Emma gestured to the elaborate diamond set she was wearing, earrings, bracelet, and necklace that clearly cost more than Margaret's monthly pension. "Justin's mother lent these to me. They're family heirlooms, too." The rejection hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at the borrowed diamonds adorning her daughter, expensive symbols of acceptance into a family that valued her more for her potential than her history. "I understand," Margaret said quietly, though she didn't understand at all. "Maybe you'd like to keep it for someday." "Maybe," Emma said, but she made no move to take the box. One of the bridesmaids, a tall blonde, whose name Margaret couldn't remember, cleared her throat. "Emma, we really should finish getting ready. The photographer will be here for pre-ceremony shots in 20 minutes. "Of course," Emma turned back to Margaret and Richard. "I'm sorry, but we're really pressed for time. Maybe we could catch up later, after the ceremony." Margaret felt dismissed, but she forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. We don't want to keep you." They lingered in the doorway for another moment, neither parent quite ready to leave. This felt like it should be a bigger moment, seeing their only child in her wedding dress, sharing the anticipation of the ceremony to come. Instead, it felt like a brief appointment that had run over its allotted time. "We're so proud of you," Richard said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "You know that, right? Whatever happens, we're so proud of the woman you've become." Something shifted in Emma's expression, a crack in her composed facade. For just an instant, she looked like she might cry, might bridge the growing distance between them with an embrace or honest words. But then Justin appeared in the doorway behind her parents. "Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," he said with the easy charm that had first impressed them 2 years ago. "Thanks for making all this possible. Emma and I can't wait to celebrate with everyone." He placed a possessive hand on Emma's shoulder, and Margaret watched her daughter transform again, her features smoothing into the practiced smile she'd perfected during their engagement. "We should let you get ready," Margaret said, recognizing defeat. "We'll see you out there." As they walked away from the bridal suite, Margaret clutched the silver box tighter. The necklace inside seemed to pulse with the weight of rejection. 4 generations of love reduced to maybe someday. "She didn't even look at it," Margaret said once they were out of earshot. "She's nervous," Richard replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Wedding day stress. They found themselves in the main lobby watching other guests arrive and mingle with champagne and small talk. Margaret recognized some faces. Emma's old friends from high school, a few colleagues from her previous job in Colorado Springs, relatives from both sides of the family. But increasingly, the crowd filled with strangers, people connected to Justin and his family's social circle. "Richard? Margaret, there you are." Margaret turned to find Helen Hayward, Justin's mother, approaching them with a kind of smile that seemed genuine but felt calculated. Helen was everything Margaret was not: polished, connected, comfortable in spaces that required significant wealth to access casually. "Helen," Margaret responded, accepting the air kiss Helen offered. "Everything looks beautiful, doesn't it? Though I have to admit, I was a bit concerned about some of the vendor choices initially. But Emma was so insistent on handling the details herself, and you know how brides can be about their vision." Helen's tone was light, but Margaret caught the underlying message. The vendors, the ones Margaret had researched and booked, weren't quite up to the Hayward family's usual standards. "We wanted Emma to have exactly what she wanted. Of course, though between you and me, I think she might have been a bit overwhelmed by the whole process. Justin and I ended up helping with quite a few last-minute changes." Helen glanced around the venue with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating event spaces. "The flowers turned out lovely, though we did have to supplement them with some arrangements from our usual florist. And the menu, well, we made some adjustments to accommodate our guests' expectations." Each comment felt like a small cut, a gentle but persistent criticism of the choices Margaret had helped make, the vendors she'd vetted, the wedding she'd financed, but apparently hadn't executed to Hayward standards. "I'm sure everything will be perfect," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice level. "Oh, it will be. We've made sure of that." Helen's smile never wavered. "Though I do hope the photographer captures the right moments. Some of these smaller operations don't always understand how to handle events of this caliber." The photographer was someone Margaret had researched extensively, whose portfolio had impressed both her and Emma during their initial consultations. The same photographer who was now apparently inadequate by Hayward standards. "If you'll excuse us," Helen continued, "I should check on the final details. You know how it is. Someone has to ensure everything runs smoothly." She glided away, leaving Margaret and Richard standing alone again, the taste of subtle condescension lingering in the air. Did she just Richard began. Criticize every choice we made while thanking us for making them? Yes. Margaret watched Helen disappear into the venue's administrative area, no doubt to oversee improvements to the wedding Margaret had planned and paid for. They stood in uncomfortable silence, watching the pre-ceremony bustle around them. Margaret felt increasingly like a stranger at someone else's event. Despite the fact that her name was on every contract, her money had funded every detail. Maybe we should find our seats, Richard suggested. But as they approached the garden where the ceremony would take place, Diana, the wedding coordinator, intercepted them with an apologetic expression. "I'm so sorry," she said in the tone of someone delivering unwelcome news. "There's been a small change to the seating arrangements. Emma asked me to let you know that you've been moved to accommodate some last-minute family additions from the groom's side." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Moved to where?" "Table 12, near the back. It's actually a lovely spot with a great view of the gardens." Table 12. Margaret knew from reviewing the seating charts that this was where they'd placed distant relatives and plus ones, people with minimal connection to the couple. She and Richard, the bride's parents, who had paid for every aspect of this celebration, had been relegated to the equivalent of the children's table. "I see," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled. "And where will Emma's immediate family be seated?" Diana's discomfort was palpable. "Well, the Haywards requested that the front tables be reserved for their extended family, given the number of out-of-town guests they're hosting. Emma thought you'd understand." Emma thought they'd understand being treated like distant acquaintances at their own daughter's wedding. Emma, who had once cried in Margaret's arms about feeling excluded from her middle school friend group, now orchestrating her own parents' exclusion from the most important day of her life. "Of course," Margaret heard herself say, "whatever Emma wants." But as Diana hurried away, Margaret felt something inside her crystallize into a hard, cold certainty. This wasn't about wedding stress or accommodating guests, or even about the natural tension between old family and new. This was about Emma choosing the Haywards' approval over her own parents' dignity, and it had been building for months. The silver box in her hands felt heavier now, weighted not just with family history, but with the recognition of how little that history seemed to matter to the one person who should have treasured it most. "Margaret," Richard said quietly, and she could hear the warning in his voice. He knew her well enough to recognize when her patience was reaching its breaking point, but before she could respond, a commotion near the bridal suite caught their attention. Voices raised in what sounded like heated discussion, though the words weren't clear from their distance. "Stay here," Richard said, moving toward the sound. Margaret followed anyway, her maternal instincts overriding good sense. As they got closer, she could make out Emma's voice, tight with stress, and Justin's, trying to be soothing but failing. "Told you this would happen," Emma was saying. "I told you they wouldn't understand the way things work." "Baby, it's going to be fine," Justin replied. "We've handled everything else. We can handle this too. But what if they make a scene? What if they embarrass us in front of your family?" Margaret stopped walking, the words hitting her like a physical blow. Emma wasn't worried about her parents' feelings or their rightful place in her wedding. She was worried about being embarrassed by them. Richard had stopped too, his face pale with the same realization that was washing over Margaret. Their daughter saw them as a potential embarrassment, a liability to be managed, rather than family to be celebrated. The conversation inside continued, Emma's voice becoming more agitated. "Maybe we should just ask them to leave before the ceremony. Tell them there's been a change, that we're keeping it smaller." "Emma, they're your parents," Justin said, though his tone suggested he was considering the proposal. "And they did pay for all this. I know, but your parents will never let me forget it if something goes wrong. Your mother already commented on their style choices. Their style choices." Margaret looked down at her carefully selected blue dress, the one she'd bought specifically to complement Emma's wedding colors, without Richard's classic navy suit, conservative and appropriate for any formal occasion. What about their appearance could possibly be embarrassing to their daughter? The answer came with painful clarity. It wasn't their clothes or their manners or their behavior. It was who they were. Two retired teachers from a small Colorado town, people who had worked their entire lives to provide for their family, but had never accumulated the kind of wealth or social connections that the Haywards took for granted. Margaret felt 15 years of suppressed feelings rush to the surface, years of Richard's affair that she'd forgiven but never forgotten, years of putting everyone else's needs before her own, years of bending herself into whatever shape was required to keep peace in her family. And now this, being asked to disappear from her own daughter's wedding because her presence might embarrass the bride. "Margaret," Richard whispered urgently, "let's go. We don't need to hear this." But it was too late. The damage was done, the truth finally exposed. Emma was ashamed of them, had been ashamed of them for months, maybe years. All the subtle exclusions, the gradual distancing, the increasing reliance on the Haywards for guidance, it all made sense now. Margaret turned and walked back toward the lobby, her steps measured and deliberate. Behind her, she could hear Richard following, calling her name softly. But she didn't stop until she reached the main entrance, where guests were still arriving for what they believed would be a joyful family celebration. She stood there for a moment, watching strangers prepare to witness her daughter's wedding while she and Richard were being discussed as potential embarrassments to be managed or removed. The silver box in her hands felt like evidence now, proof of how little their family history, their love, their sacrifices meant to the daughter they had given everything. That's when Diana appeared with her apologetic smile and her gentle suggestion that they speak with Emma one more time before the ceremony began. That's when they walked back to the bridal suite, past the flowers they'd chosen and the decorations they'd approved, to receive the final blow that would change everything. "Mom, Dad, you're not invited." And now here they stood, 30 years of parenthood reduced to this moment of ultimate rejection, while around them a wedding continued to take shape. Their wedding, paid for with their money, planned with their time, but no longer their celebration to attend. The cafe was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon, just Margaret and Richard sitting at a corner table with their untouched coffee growing cold. Outside, life continued as normal. People walking dogs, children riding bicycles, the ordinary rhythms of a Saturday in Lakewood. But inside the small space, everything had changed. Margaret's phone lay face up on the table between them, displaying the contacts list she'd spent the last hour compiling. Vendors, service providers, everyone whose signature matched hers on the contracts that were, at this very moment, creating Emma's perfect wedding. "Are you sure about this?" Richard asked for the third time, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at him across the table, this man who had been her partner through everything, including the affair 15 years ago that had nearly destroyed them. The affair with his teaching assistant that Emma had somehow learned about and had used as ammunition ever since, as if Margaret's decision to forgive and rebuild their marriage was evidence of weakness rather than strength. "She told us we weren't welcome at our own daughter's wedding," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The wedding we paid for, the wedding we planned. She's ashamed of us, Richard." She said so herself. Richard's face was pale, aged by more than just the afternoon's revelations. "But if we do this, she'll learn that actions have consequences, that you can't take people's love and money and then discard them when they become inconvenient. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed the first number on her list. Riverside Gardens, this is Diana speaking. Diana, this is Margaret Wilson. I need to speak with you about today's wedding. Mrs. Wilson, is everything all right? I thought you'd left. I did, and I'm calling to cancel the remaining services under our contract. The silence on the other end was profound. Margaret could almost hear Diana's mind racing, trying to process what she was hearing. I'm sorry, I don't understand. The ceremony is starting in 20 minutes. I understand the timing, Margaret said calmly, but I'm the one who signed the contracts, and I'm the one making payments. I'm canceling effective immediately. Mrs. Wilson, this is highly unusual. We have guests seated, vendors in place. That's not my concern anymore. Please confirm the cancellation and send me documentation of any penalties. Margaret ended the call before Diana could respond. Richard was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, admiration, fear all mixed together. One down, she said, and dialed the florist. The conversation followed a similar pattern. Confusion, protests about timing, threats about cancellation fees. Margaret remained polite, but implacable. By the fourth call, the photographer. Word was clearly spreading. The woman answered with a hesitant, "Is this about the Wilson-Hayward wedding?" "It is. I'm canceling our contract. Ma'am, I'm already here taking photos. The ceremony has begun." Margaret felt a brief pang. Emma walking down the aisle without them, surrounded by flowers they'd chosen but were no longer paying for. Photographed by someone who would soon pack up and leave. But the pain was overwhelmed by something else. Relief. For the first time in 30 years, she was putting herself first. Send me the bill for your time today and any cancellation fees, but no more photos. The caterer was next, then the musicians, then the cake decorator, who was putting finishing touches on the three-tier creation Emma had insisted upon. With each call, Margaret felt lighter, as if she were shedding a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Her phone began buzzing with incoming calls as word spread through the venue. Emma's number appeared on the screen repeatedly, then Justin's, then numbers she didn't recognize. Probably wedding party members or Hayward family trying to reach the people who had just pulled the financial foundation out from under their celebration. Margaret declined every call. "It's done," she said finally, setting her phone face down on the table. Richard reached across and took her hand. His was shaking slightly, but his grip was firm. "How do you feel?" Margaret considered the question seriously. How did she feel? Not guilty, surprisingly. Not sad, exactly. Not even angry anymore. Free, she said, and realized it was true. For the first time in years, I feel free. They sat in silence for a while, processing what they'd done. Around them, the cafe filled with the usual Saturday afternoon crowd, families with children, couples on dates, friends catching up over coffee. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the weight of ungrateful children and failed expectations. "What happens now?" Richard asked eventually. "Now we go home, we change out of these wedding clothes, and we figure out what our lives look like when we're not constantly trying to earn someone else's approval." Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Emma. "What is happening? Everything is falling apart. Why would you do this?" Margaret read it twice, then showed it to Richard. Even in crisis, Emma couldn't bring herself to apologize or acknowledge what she'd done. It was all about the consequences she was facing, not the actions that had caused them. Margaret typed back, "You told us we weren't invited, so we left, and we took our contribution with us." Emma's response came immediately, "I didn't mean it like that. You know how stressful weddings are. Can't you fix this? Can't you fix this?" Not, "I'm sorry," or "I made a mistake," or "Please forgive me." Just an expectation that Margaret would clean up the mess Emma had created, the way she always had. Margaret turned off her phone without responding. 3 days later, Margaret was in her garden when she saw the car pull into their driveway. She'd spent the morning planting summer annuals, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of digging, planting, watering. The physical work felt good after 3 days of emotional turbulence, grounding her in something real and immediate. Through the kitchen window, she could see Richard at the table with his laptop, researching something that had been making him smile mysteriously for the past 2 days. He'd been different since Saturday. Lighter, more decisive, as if Emma's rejection had freed him from something too. The car door slammed, and Margaret looked up to see Emma walking toward the house. Not the confident, polished woman from the wedding day, but someone who looked like she'd aged years in 3 days. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, her face puffy from crying. Margaret stood slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. Part of her wanted to rush inside to avoid this conversation entirely. But running had never been her way, even when it might have been wiser. Emma knocked on the front door instead of using her key, a small courtesy that Margaret noted with surprise. Richard answered, and Margaret could hear their voices through the open windows, though not the words. After a moment, Richard called her name. "I'm coming," she replied, taking her time to put away her gardening tools and wash her hands. Let Emma wait. For 30 years, Margaret had dropped everything whenever Emma needed something. Those days were over. When Margaret entered the living room, Emma was perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisted in her lap. She looked up when Margaret appeared, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Mom," she began, and her voice broke on the single word. Margaret sat in the armchair across from her daughter, noting how the familiar space suddenly felt formal, like a meeting between strangers. Richard remained standing, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Emma," Margaret said neutrally, "I don't know where to start." "How about with an apology?" Richard suggested, his voice harder than Margaret had heard it in years. Emma flinched. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for things to go that far." "What exactly are you sorry for?" Margaret asked. "For asking us to leave your wedding, or for getting caught complaining about how we might embarrass you?" Emma's face crumpled. "You heard that. We heard you discussing whether to throw us out before the ceremony even started. We heard you worrying about our style choices embarrassing you in front of the Haywards." Margaret's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "So yes, we heard. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." Richard moved to stand behind Margaret's chair, a united front. "You were ashamed of us, your own parents, who sacrificed everything to give you that wedding." Emma began crying then, the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who had lost everything and was finally beginning to understand why. Margaret felt a familiar urge to comfort her, to smooth over the pain and make it better. But she remained in her chair, watching her daughter face the consequences of her choices. "Where's Justin?" Margaret asked when Emma's sobs subsided. Emma's face went white. He left 2 days ago. He took his things and went back to Denver. He said," Emma's voice caught, "he said his family was right about me, that I came from trash and would always be trash, and that he couldn't be associated with someone whose own parents would sabotage their wedding." The cruelty of it took Margaret's breath away. Not just Justin's words, but the deeper betrayal. Emma had thrown away her family to gain acceptance from people who had never intended to accept her at all. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly, and meant it. No matter what Emma had done, she didn't deserve to be abandoned and insulted by the man she'd just married. "He cleaned out our bank accounts," Emma continued, her voice hollow. "The ones I put the wedding gift money into, from your friends and relatives. He took everything." Richard's sharp intake of breath was audible. "The wedding gifts, Thousands of dollars from people who loved Emma and had wanted to help her start her new life. All gone. What about the house in Denver? Margaret asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. It was never ours. It was his parents' investment property. They let us live there while we were engaged, but Emma shrugged helplessly. I have nowhere to go. The old Margaret would have immediately offered solutions: money, a place to stay, help cleaning up the mess. The new Margaret remained silent, waiting to see what Emma would ask for. I know I don't deserve it, Emma said finally, but could I stay here for a while, just until I figure things out? Margaret looked at Richard, reading the conflict in his eyes. He was angry, angrier than she'd ever seen him, but he was also a father, watching his child in pain. Under what conditions? Margaret asked. Emma blinked, surprised. Conditions? You can't just move back into your old room and pretend the last few years didn't happen. If you stay here, there will be rules, expectations. Okay, Emma said quickly. Whatever you want. I want an honest accounting of your debts and financial situation. I want you to get a job within 2 weeks and contribute to household expenses. I want you to attend counseling, both individual therapy and family sessions with us. Emma nodded eagerly. Yes, all of that. Thank you, Mom. Thank you. I'm not finished. Margaret's voice cut through Emma's gratitude. I also want the truth about everything. How long you've been ashamed of us, why you chose Justin's family over your own, what you really think of the people who raised you and loved you unconditionally for 30 years. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Emma stared at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I wanted to be different. I wanted to be someone who mattered, someone important. Justin's world was so glamorous, so sophisticated. His family had money and connections and respect. She looked up at Margaret with eyes full of pain. And you were just ordinary. A teacher married to a teacher, living in the same small town where you grew up. I was embarrassed by how ordinary we were. The honesty was brutal, but Margaret appreciated it more than any of Emma's previous excuses and justifications. This was the truth, finally. Ugly and painful, but real. And the affair, Margaret said quietly. How long have you been using your father's mistake against me? Emma's face flushed. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Every time I tried to set boundaries with you, every time I questioned your choices, you'd remind me that I wasn't strong enough to leave Dad when he cheated, that I was weak and pathetic for forgiving him. Richard's hand found Margaret's shoulder, a gesture of support that hadn't gone unnoticed. Emma saw it too, and something shifted in her expression. I was angry, she whispered. I was angry at both of you. At him for betraying us, and at you for staying. I thought you were teaching me that women should accept whatever men do to them. And now, Margaret asked, now I realize that forgiveness is harder than leaving, that staying and rebuilding takes more strength than I ever understood. Emma's voice was stronger now, more honest than Margaret had heard in years. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for using your pain against you. I'm sorry for being ashamed of you and Dad. I'm sorry for throwing away the best parts of myself to try to become someone I thought was better. Margaret felt tears threatening for the first time since Saturday. This was the daughter she remembered. Honest, vulnerable, capable of real remorse and growth. Apology accepted, she said quietly, but acceptance doesn't mean trust. That has to be earned back. Emma nodded. I understand. And Emma, Margaret leaned forward slightly, if you stay here, you stay as our adult daughter, not as our child to be rescued. You're 28 years old. It's time you learned to save yourself. 2 weeks later, Margaret was sorting through the mail when she found the letter, addressed to Emma Wilson, not Emma Hayward, which struck her as odd since Emma had been Mrs. Hayward for exactly 17 days before Justin's departure. The return address was from a law firm in Denver. Emma was at work. She'd found a position with a local marketing company, entry level but steady, and Richard was at his weekly coffee with fellow retired teachers. Margaret stared at the envelope, her maternal instincts warring with her newly established boundaries. In the past, she would have opened it without hesitation, would have handled whatever crisis it contained before Emma even knew about it. But that Margaret was gone, replaced by someone who respected other people's privacy and expected them to handle their own problems. She set the letter on the kitchen counter where Emma would find it and went back to her own mail. That evening, Emma emerged from her room with the letter in her hand and an expression Margaret couldn't read. "Mom, Dad, could we talk?" They gathered in the living room, the same formation they'd held 2 weeks earlier, but with a different energy. Emma no longer looked like a broken victim. She looked like a woman preparing to face something difficult. "I got this today," she said, holding up the letter. "It's from a lawyer in Denver. Apparently, Justin is filing for an annulment." "An annulment?" Richard frowned. "Not a divorce. He's claiming fraud. Says I misrepresented my financial situation and family background." Emma's voice was bitter. "According to this, he's arguing that he never would have married me if he'd known the truth about us." Margaret felt a familiar rage building, but it was different now. Cleaner, more focused. "What truth? That you come from a loving family that worked hard and saved money to give you everything you wanted? That we're not rich? That we're not connected? That Dad was a public school shop teacher and you taught kindergarten instead of running charity galas or sitting on museum boards?" Emma set the letter down carefully. "He's painting me as a gold digger who lied to trap him into marriage. That's ridiculous," Richard said. "He has no grounds. Actually, he might." Emma's voice was quiet. "Because I did lie. Not about money. I never claimed to be wealthy. But about who we were, what our family was like. I let him and his parents believe that you were different than you are." Margaret studied her daughter's face, seeing something she'd never seen before. Genuine shame that wasn't about appearances or social standing, but about the betrayal of people who had loved her. "There's something else," Emma continued. "The lawyer wants to meet with me next week, and he's asking for financial records, bank statements, tax returns, employment history. For all of us. Why would they need our information?" Margaret asked. "I think they're trying to prove that I married Justin to gain access to his family's money and social position, that I was never a legitimate partner, just an opportunist." The irony was almost too much to bear. Emma, who had been so desperate to join Justin's world that she'd rejected her own family, was now being painted as someone who had manipulated her way into that same world. "What do you want to do?" Richard asked. Emma looked at both of her parents, and Margaret saw something in her expression that had been missing for years. Respect. Not the performative respect of someone trying to get something, but genuine regard for their opinions and judgment. "I want to fight it," Emma said. "Not because I want to stay married to him. That's over. But because what he's saying isn't true. And because letting him win would mean admitting that everything he said about our family was right." Margaret felt a swell of pride, the first genuine pride she'd felt in Emma's choices in years. "Then we fight," she said simply. "We?" Emma's voice was careful, hopeful. "You fight," Margaret corrected. "But you won't fight alone." Over the next hour, they discussed strategy. Emma would hire her own lawyer, would gather the evidence to disprove Justin's claims. Margaret and Richard would provide whatever documentation was needed, but this would be Emma's battle to win or lose. As they talked, Margaret found herself seeing Emma differently. The desperate, grasping woman who had thrown her parents out of her wedding was gone, replaced by someone who was learning to stand on her own feet and fight her own battles. "There's one more thing," Emma said as they were finishing up. The lawyer mentioned that Justin's family might be facing some financial difficulties. There's something about his father's business, some kind of investigation. Margaret and Richard exchanged glances. They'd suspected something was off about the Hayward family's financial situation. Too many contradictions, too much emphasis on appearances that didn't quite add up. What kind of investigation? The lawyer wouldn't give me details, but he mentioned something about fraudulent investment schemes. Apparently, Justin's father has been under investigation by the SEC for months. The pieces were falling into place with ugly clarity. The Hayward family, desperate to maintain their lifestyle and reputation while under federal investigation, had seen Emma, and by extension Margaret and Richard, as a lifeline, fresh money, clean connections, a respectable family to marry into. Except Margaret and Richard weren't wealthy enough to be useful, and Emma wasn't sophisticated enough to be an asset. So they'd taken what they could: the wedding money, the gifts, the temporary respectability, and then discarded Emma when she became inconvenient. "I was so stupid," Emma said quietly. "I was so desperate to be part of their world that I never stopped to ask why they wanted me in it." "You weren't stupid," Margaret said. "You were hopeful. There's a difference." Emma looked up, tears in her eyes. "How can you be so kind to me? After everything I did, everything I said?" Margaret considered the question seriously. How could she be kind to someone who had hurt her so deeply, who had rejected everything she'd tried to give? "Because you're my daughter," she said finally. "Not because of your choices or your successes or your failures, but because you're mine. That doesn't mean I'll enable you or rescue you from every consequence, but it does mean I'll love you through the process of becoming who you're supposed to be." Emma began crying then. Not the desperate sobs of 2 weeks ago, but the cleaner tears of someone who was finally beginning to understand what she'd lost and what she might still be able to recover. "I love you too, Mom. Both of you. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of that love." "You don't have to prove anything," Richard said gently. "You just have to choose better. Every day, choose better." Margaret reached across the coffee table and took Emma's hand, not to comfort or rescue, but to connect. For the first time in years, it felt like Emma was really there to receive it. 6 weeks after the wedding, the law office in downtown Denver was all glass and steel, the kind of place designed to intimidate people who weren't used to paying hundreds of dollars per hour for legal advice. Emma sat between her lawyer, Sarah Chen, and Margaret, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Across the conference table, Justin sat with his attorney and his parents. He looked different, thinner, older, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. His parents flanked him like bodyguards, their faces set in expressions of cold superiority that Margaret recognized from the wedding day. "Before we begin," Sarah Chen said, opening a thick folder, "I think everyone should understand what we've discovered during our investigation into Mr. Hayward's claims." She slid a document across the table to Justin's lawyer. "As you can see, my client has been completely transparent about her family's financial situation. Tax returns, employment records, bank statements. Everything confirms that Emma Wilson married your client in good faith, with no intent to defraud or deceive." Justin's lawyer, a silver-haired man who looked like he charged by the syllable, barely glanced at the papers. "Mr. Hayward maintains that Miss Wilson misrepresented her family's social and financial standing." "Actually," Sarah interrupted, "that's interesting. You should mention misrepresentation, because our investigation has revealed some fascinating information about the Hayward family's actual financial situation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Justin's father, James Hayward, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What are you implying?" Justin's lawyer asked. Sarah smiled. the predatory smile of someone who had been looking forward to this moment. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Mr. James Hayward is currently under federal investigation for running a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of approximately $12 million. The family's assets have been frozen, their properties are in foreclosure, and Mr. Hayward is facing federal charges that could result in 20 years in prison." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stared at Justin, who couldn't meet her eyes. This was the family she'd been so desperate to join, the sophisticated world she'd valued over her own parents' honest love. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "we have evidence that Mr. Justin Hayward specifically targeted my client because he knew her parents had assets that could be accessed. The wedding was funded entirely by the Wilson family's retirement savings that Mr. Hayward planned to gain access." Margaret felt sick, not just about the money, but about the calculated nature of Justin's pursuit of Emma. He hadn't fallen in love with her daughter. He'd identified her as a mark. "That's preposterous." James Hayward spoke for the first time, his voice tight with anger. "Justin genuinely cared for Emma, did he?" Sarah pulled out another document. "Because we have evidence that Mr. Justin Hayward was already married at the time of his ceremony with my client. His divorce from Jennifer Martinez was never finalized, making his marriage to Emma invalid from the beginning." Emma gasped audibly. Margaret reached for her hand instinctively, then stopped herself. This was Emma's battle to fight, her pain to process. "You're lying," Justin said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "Am I?" Sarah slid a marriage certificate across the table. "This is your marriage to Jennifer Martinez, dated 3 years ago. Here's the divorce petition, filed but never completed. And here's the private investigator's report showing that you've been maintaining residences in both Colorado and Arizona, where Ms. Martinez..." Margaret watched Emma's face go through a series of expressions: shock, betrayal, disgust, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. The man she'd thrown away her family for wasn't just a fraud. He was someone who had never been available to marry her in the first place. "So you see," Sarah concluded, "Mr. Hayward's annulment petition is actually unnecessary. The marriage was never legal to begin with. What we're here to discuss is restitution for the fraud perpetrated against my client and her family." The next hour was a blur of legal terminology and heated negotiations. In the end, they settled for partial restitution, less than they'd lost, but enough to cover Emma's legal fees and provide some compensation for the emotional damage. The Hayward family had already lost most of their assets to federal seizure, so there wasn't much to recover anyway. As they walked out of the building into the bright Colorado sunshine, Emma was quiet. Too quiet. "Are you okay?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Emma replied honestly. "I feel like such a fool." "You were a victim of fraud," Margaret said firmly. "I threw away my family, my integrity, everything that mattered, for a man who was already married to someone else. For a family that was built on lies and stolen money." Emma stopped walking and turned to face Margaret. "How do I come back from that?" Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her. Emma had lost weight over the past 6 weeks, but she looked stronger somehow, more solid. The desperate, grasping quality that had defined her for years was gone, replaced by something quieter but more real. "You don't come back from it," Margaret said. "You move forward from it. You learn from it. You choose to be different." "Have I chosen to be different?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Over the past month and a half, Emma had worked steadily at her new job, contributed to household expenses without complaint, and attended therapy twice a week. She'd been respectful, helpful, and honest in ways that the old Emma never was. "Yes," Margaret said, "I think you have. They walked to the car in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As Margaret started the engine, Emma spoke again. "Mom, thank you for standing by me through this. I know I don't deserve it." "You're my daughter," Margaret said simply. "That's what mothers do." "No," Emma said quietly, "that's what good mothers do. I'm lucky to have figured that out before it was too late." 3 months after the wedding, Margaret was on her knees in the flower bed, dividing perennials in the early autumn sunshine, when she heard footsteps on the garden path. She looked up to see Emma approaching with 2 cups of coffee, still in her work clothes, but with her sleeves rolled up. "Thought you might want a break," Emma said, settling onto the garden bench nearby. Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully and sat back on her heels, surveying her work. The garden looked good, better than it had in years. She'd been spending more time here lately, finding peace in the cycles of growth and dormancy, the honest work of nurturing living things. "How was your day?" she asked. "Good, really good, actually." Emma's voice carried a note of surprise, as if she was still getting used to genuinely enjoying her work. "We landed a new client, a local nonprofit that helps women transition out of abusive relationships. I'm going to be working on their marketing campaign." Margaret smiled. "That sounds perfect for you." "I think it is. It feels good to use my skills for something that actually matters. You know?" They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee and watching the late afternoon light filter through the maple trees. This had become their routine, Emma coming home from work, finding Margaret in the garden, sharing the small details of their separate but connected lives. "I've been thinking," Emma said eventually, "about what I want my life to look like going forward." Margaret waited, having learned over the past few months that Emma processed things better when she wasn't rushed or prompted. "I like working with the nonprofit. I like having a job that feels meaningful instead of just lucrative. I like living simply, without all the pressure to keep up appearances." Emma paused, turning the coffee cup in her hands. "I think I want to go back to school." "Oh, social work. I know it sounds crazy. I spent so many years trying to get as far away from helping people as possible, but I think maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. Help people who are in situations like I was, who've lost themselves trying to be someone else." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I think that's a wonderful idea. It would mean staying here longer. Probably 2 more years while I finish the degree. Would that be okay?" The old Margaret would have immediately said yes, would have been thrilled to keep her daughter close for any reason. The new Margaret considered the question more carefully. "What does your therapist think?" Emma smiled, the first time Margaret had seen that particular expression of rueful self-awareness from her. "She thinks I should make sure I'm choosing social work for the right reasons, not just as another way to avoid dealing with my own life." "And what do you think?" "I think she's partially right. Part of me does want to help others because it feels safer than figuring out my own stuff. But part of me genuinely believes I could make a difference, that I understand what it feels like to lose yourself in someone else's expectations." Margaret nodded. "Then I think you should do it. And yes, you can stay here while you're in school. But we need to talk about what that looks like long term." They spent the next hour discussing practical details, finances, household responsibilities, boundaries around dating and social life. It was a conversation the old Margaret and Emma could never have had, requiring a level of mutual respect and honest communication that hadn't existed in their relationship before. As the sun began to set, Emma helped Margaret gather the gardening tools and water the newly divided plants. "Mom," Emma said as they were putting things away, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." Margaret braced herself, recognizing the tone that usually preceded difficult conversations. Do you think you'll ever be able to trust me completely again? Not just with small things, but with the big stuff, with your heart. The question hit Margaret like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was so perceptive. Emma had identified the core issue that Margaret had been wrestling with for months, the difference between forgiveness and trust, between loving someone and being vulnerable to them. Margaret leaned against the garden shed, considering her words carefully. "I think trust is like this garden," she said finally. "You can't just plant it and expect it to grow overnight. You have to tend it consistently, season after season, year after year. And sometimes plants die and you have to start over." Emma's face was serious, intent. "So the trust we had before, that's dead." "Yes," Margaret said, and saw Emma flinch. "But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The trust we had before was based on me never saying no to you, never challenging you, never expecting you to consider my feelings. That wasn't healthy trust. That was enabling. And now we're building something different. Trust based on mutual respect, on you proving through your actions that you value our relationship, on both of us being honest about our needs and boundaries." Emma nodded slowly. "That's harder, much harder, but stronger, I think, more real." They finished putting away the tools in comfortable silence, both lost in thought. As they walked back toward the house, Emma spoke again. "I want to earn it, the new trust, however long it takes." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she'd been carrying for months without realizing it. Not because the work was done, they still had years of rebuilding ahead of them, but because for the first time, she truly believed Emma understood what they were building toward. "Good," she said simply, "because I want to give it to you." 1 year after the wedding, the community center was buzzing with activity as Margaret helped set up for the annual volunteer appreciation dinner. She was arranging flowers, simple sunflowers and chrysanthemums from her own garden, when she saw Emma enter the room carrying a stack of programs. Over the past year, both women had become heavily involved in the local women's shelter. Margaret as a volunteer art therapist, and Emma as a part-time social work intern while finishing her degree. It was work that fulfilled them both, and work they could do side by side without the complicated dynamics of their mother-daughter relationship interfering. "The programs look great," Margaret said, as Emma distributed them around the tables. "Thanks. I still can't believe they asked me to design them." Emma's voice carried genuine pride, the kind that came from work well done rather than external recognition. Margaret looked at the program in her hand. Emma had created something simple but elegant, featuring artwork from some of the children at the shelter. It was professional quality work, but more than that, it was thoughtful work that honored the people it represented. "You've gotten really good at this," Margaret said. "I had a good teacher." Emma smiled, but there was no manipulation in it, no attempt to curry favor, just genuine affection and gratitude. They worked together in comfortable efficiency, setting up the room for the evening's celebration. Margaret found herself marveling at how natural this felt, working alongside Emma as equals, each contributing their own skills to a shared purpose. "Margaret, Emma," Sarah Hendricks, the shelter director, approached with a warm smile. "I'm so glad you're both here. I have some news to share." They paused in their setup work, giving Sarah their full attention. "We just received word that our grant application was approved, the one for expanding our transitional housing program." Sarah's eyes were bright with excitement. "Emma, your research and proposal writing were instrumental in making this happen. And Margaret, the art therapy program you developed was specifically cited as a model component." Margaret felt a flush of pride. not just for herself, but for Emma. Over the past year, she'd watched her daughter throw herself into social work with the same intensity she'd once applied to climbing social ladders, but this time in service of... That's wonderful news, Margaret said. There's more, Sarah continued. The foundation wants to feature our program in their annual report. They're sending a photographer next week to document our work, and they specifically want to highlight the mother-daughter volunteer team that's been so effective. Emma and Margaret exchanged glances. A year ago, being identified as a mother-daughter team would have embarrassed Emma. Now she looked genuinely pleased. "We'd be honored," Emma said. After Sarah left, they continued their preparations in thoughtful silence. Finally, Emma spoke. "A year ago today," she said quietly. Margaret nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. A year ago, they'd been preparing for Emma's wedding. A year ago, Margaret had been buffing the family pearls and dreaming of passing down traditions. A year ago, their relationship had been broken in ways that seemed irreparable. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked. "What you did that day," Margaret considered the question seriously. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret the pain it caused everyone involved. But no, I don't regret standing up for myself and your father." "I'm glad you did it," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm glad you finally put yourself first." The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with all the growth and healing of the past 12 months. "Emma," Margaret said carefully, "can I ask you something? Anything? Are you happy, really happy, not just recovering or rebuilding, but genuinely content with your life?" Emma paused in her work, really considering the question. "You know what? I think I am. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I'm living a life that feels authentic to who I actually am, not who I thought I should be." She straightened a tablecloth, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. "I like waking up and knowing that my work matters. I like paying my own bills and making my own decisions. I like being respected for my competence rather than my connections or my appearance." "And relationships?" Margaret asked gently. "Do you think you'll want to date again eventually? Maybe, probably, but not for a while, and definitely not the way I used to." Emma's voice was thoughtful. "I think I need to be completely comfortable being alone before I try to be with someone else. I need to know that I won't lose myself in someone else's expectations again." Margaret nodded, recognizing the wisdom in that approach. "That sounds very mature." "I learned from the best," Emma said, then caught herself. "I mean, I know what you mean," Margaret interrupted gently. "And thank you." They finished the setup as the sun set through the community center's windows, painting everything in warm golden light. Other volunteers began arriving for the dinner, people Margaret had come to know and respect over the past year of service. Richard appeared in the doorway, looking handsome in his good jacket and the tie Emma had given him for his birthday. Over the past year, he'd found his own forms of meaningful engagement, coaching high school boys in woodworking and home repair, teaching practical skills to young men who often lacked father figures in their lives. "Ladies," he said with a smile that reached his eyes, "you've outdone yourselves. This place looks beautiful." "We make a good team," Emma said, and Margaret heard the multiple layers of meaning in those words. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself watching Emma interact with the other volunteers and shelter residents. She saw genuine compassion, real listening skills, and a kind of humble confidence that was entirely new. This was who Emma was becoming. Not the anxious, grasping woman who had rejected her parents, but someone who had learned to find value in service rather than status. During dinner, Sarah Hendricks stood to thank the volunteers, reading excerpts from letters written by women who had been helped by their programs. One letter from a woman who had completed the transitional housing program specifically mentioned Emma's support during her job search. "Emma Wilson helped me practice for interviews and write my resume." the letter read. But more than that, she believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. She told me that your past doesn't have to determine your future, that you can choose to become different. She saved my life. Margaret saw tears in Emma's eyes and felt her own throat tighten with emotion. This was what redemption looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but the quiet, consistent work of becoming someone worthy of the trust and love she'd been given. After dinner, as they were cleaning up, Emma approached Margaret with something in her hands. "I have something for you," she said. "It's not much, but—" She held out a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple silver bracelet, handmade with care but not expensive. "I made it in the jewelry making class at the community college," Emma explained. "I wanted to give you something that represented who we are now, not who we used to be." Margaret examined the bracelet closely. It was beautiful in its simplicity, 3 interwoven silver bands that caught the light as they moved. "The 3 bands represent past, present, and future," Emma said. "How they're all connected, but how the future doesn't have to look like the past." Margaret fastened the bracelet around her wrist, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift and what it represented. "It's perfect. Thank you." "Thank you," Emma replied, "for giving me the chance to become someone better, for not giving up on me even when I gave up on myself." They embraced then, and for the first time in years, it felt completely natural. Not desperate or manipulative or performative, but simply the connection between 2 women who had learned to love each other honestly. 18 months after the wedding, the art gallery was small, but well respected. The kind of place that showcased local artists with serious talent rather than commercial appeal. Margaret stood before her painting, a landscape of her garden in full summer bloom, feeling nervous in a way she hadn't experienced since her teaching days. "Mom, this is incredible," Emma said, studying the canvas with genuine admiration. "I had no idea you were this talented." Margaret smiled, still adjusting to this version of Emma, the one who offered sincere compliments without ulterior motives, who showed up to support her mother's first art show because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated. "I've been painting in secret for years," Margaret admitted. "Never thought anyone would want to see the results." "Well, you were wrong," Richard said, approaching with 2 glasses of wine. "I just heard 3 different people inquiring about purchasing your work." The opening reception was small, but warm, filled with people from their community. Neighbors, fellow volunteers, members of the gardening club Margaret had joined. Emma moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, engaging in conversations about art and community, looking genuinely interested in what others had to say. Margaret watched her daughter with something approaching amazement. This was the person Emma had always had the potential to become: thoughtful, engaged, secure in herself, without needing constant She turned to see Helen Brennan, her former principal, approaching with a warm smile. "I always knew you had hidden talents. These paintings are extraordinary." They chatted for a few minutes about art and retirement and the satisfaction of pursuing delayed dreams. As Helen moved on to examine other paintings, Emma appeared at Margaret's elbow. "I'm proud of you," Emma said quietly, "for following your passion, for taking risks, for not letting age or fear stop you from trying something new. Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching people enjoy Margaret's work. Then Emma spoke again. "I have some news. I wasn't sure when to tell you." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. A year and a half of positive changes hadn't entirely eliminated her instinctive worry about Emma's announcements. "I got accepted to the graduate program at Denver University, the MSW program with a specialization in trauma counseling." Margaret's anxiety evaporated, replaced by pure joy. "Emma, that's wonderful. When do you start?" fall semester. It's a 2-year program, but I can do my field placement at the women's shelter here in town. Emma paused. I was hoping I could continue living with you and Dad while I'm in school, but I understand if you think it's time for me to move out. Margaret considered this carefully. 18 months ago, the thought of Emma leaving would have panicked her. Now, she felt confident that their relationship was strong enough to survive physical distance and secure enough in who she was to not need Emma's presence to feel complete. "What do you want to do?" Margaret asked. "Honestly, I'd love to stay. Not because I can't afford to live on my own. I've been saving money, and I could rent a small apartment in Denver. But because I like our life together. I like our evening conversations, and our weekend garden work, and the way we support each other's goals." Margaret smiled, recognizing the honesty in Emma's words. This wasn't dependence or manipulation. It was genuine affection and mutual benefit. "Then stay," she said. "We'd love to have you." "Are you sure? You and Dad have built such a nice life together since I've been back. I don't want to intrude on that." "You're not intruding," Margaret said firmly. "You're contributing. There's a difference." Later that evening, after the reception had ended and they'd helped clean up the gallery, the three of them sat on the back porch with cups of tea, processing the day's events. "I still can't believe people want to buy your paintings," Emma said, "though I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been creative, even when you were teaching. I remember those elaborate bulletin boards you used to make. Those were nothing compared to this," Richard said, gesturing toward the portfolio of paintings Margaret had brought home unsold. "I think we're living with a genuine artist." Margaret felt herself blushing slightly. At 67, she was still learning to accept compliments about her work without deflecting or minimizing them. "Speaking of art," Emma said, "I have something to ask you. The women's shelter is planning a fundraising auction next spring, and Sarah wondered if you'd be willing to donate a painting, something that represents hope and new beginnings." "I'd be honored," Margaret replied without hesitation. "And I was thinking," Emma continued, "maybe I could write an artist's statement to go with it, about how it's never too late to discover hidden talents, how setbacks can become opportunities for growth." Margaret looked at her daughter with fresh eyes. A year and a half ago, Emma would have suggested that Margaret's success somehow reflected well on her, would have found a way to make herself central to the story. Now, she was simply offering to support her mother's work with her own skills. "That would be perfect," Margaret said. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The pain of that wedding day had been almost unbearable, but it had forced all of them to confront truths they'd been avoiding for years. Emma had learned that approval from the wrong people was worthless, that authentic relationships required genuine vulnerability, and that self-worth couldn't be borrowed from external sources. Margaret had learned that love without boundaries wasn't actually love, that enabling someone's worst impulses wasn't kindness, and that it was never too late to prioritize her own needs and dreams. Richard had learned that avoiding difficult conversations didn't prevent conflict, it just delayed it, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. "I've been thinking about something," Emma said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About the necklace. Grandma's pearls." Margaret's breath caught slightly. The family pearls were still in their silver box, tucked away in her jewelry drawer. She'd thought about them often over the past year and a half, wondering if they'd ever serve their intended purpose. "I know I rejected them at the wedding," Emma continued, "and I understand why you put them away. But I was wondering, someday, when I'm ready for that kind of commitment again, when I've found someone who loves me for who I really am, would you still want me to wear them?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the deep satisfaction of seeing her daughter finally understand what the necklace represented. "Of course," she said softly. But not because it's tradition, and not because I expect you to. Because when you're ready, you'll understand what they really symbolize. What's that? Love that endures. Love that survives mistakes and grows stronger through adversity. Love that connects generations of women who learned to value themselves and choose partners who valued them too. Emma nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. I'm not ready yet, but someday I will be. I know, Margaret said, and I'll be here when that day comes. They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Richard stood and began collecting the teacups. Well, ladies, he said with a smile, I'd say this has been a pretty good day. Margaret and Emma exchanged glances, both thinking about everything that phrase encompassed. A successful art show, academic acceptance, family harmony, and the quiet satisfaction of relationships that had been broken and rebuilt on stronger foundations. Yes, Margaret agreed, standing to help with cleanup. I'd say it's been a very good day indeed. As they moved through the familiar routine of closing up the house for the night, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. Not the fragile happiness that came from everyone behaving well or meeting her expectations, but the solid peace that came from knowing who she was and being surrounded by people who loved that person authentically. Emma paused at the kitchen doorway. Mom, thank you for everything. For saving me from myself, even when I didn't want to be saved. For showing me what real strength looks like. For teaching me that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be. Thank you, Margaret replied, for growing into someone worthy of that lesson, and for showing me that some relationships are worth fighting for, even when the fight is with the people you love most. Emma smiled, the radiant, genuine smile that Margaret remembered from her childhood, before life had taught her daughter to calculate the value of her expressions. Good night, Mom. I love you. Good night, sweetheart. I love you too. Margaret watched Emma head upstairs to her room, not the childhood shrine it had once been, but a simple guest room occupied by an adult daughter who had learned to stand on her own feet. Then she turned off the lights and followed Richard upstairs, feeling grateful for the unexpected gift of getting to know her daughter as a real person rather than just a reflection of her own parental success or failure. In their bedroom, as she prepared for sleep, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was older than the one who had dressed for Emma's wedding 18 months ago, but she looked stronger too. More solid, more at peace with herself and her choices. She thought about the silver box in her drawer, waiting patiently for the day when it would serve its purpose again. But she no longer felt anxious about when that day might come, or whether Emma would be ready for what it represented. Some things couldn't be rushed, and the best gifts were the ones given freely, without expectation or manipulation. The pearls would wait, and when the time was right, when Emma had found someone who loved her authentically, and she had learned to love herself the same way, they would be there to mark that moment of connection between past, present, and future. Margaret smiled as she turned off the bedside lamp. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to choose love and boundaries in equal measure. She was ready for all of it. For the first time in decades, Margaret Wilson was exactly where she belonged. In her own life, surrounded by people who had earned their place there, confident in her worth and secure in her choices. It had taken 67 years and a canceled wedding to get here. But as she drifted off to sleep beside her husband of 48 years, she couldn't imagine anywhere else she'd rather be. The pearls could wait. They had all the time in the world. The end expression softened for just a moment, and Margaret glimpsed the little girl who used to climb into her lap during thunderstorms. Then it hardened again, like water freezing in winter. Plans change, Mom. People grow. I need you to understand that this is the most important day of my life, and I need it to be perfect, and we would make it imperfect. Richard asked quietly. Emma didn't answer directly. Instead, she glanced toward the garden where guests were beginning to take their seats. Margaret followed her gaze and saw them. Justin's family, the Haywards, they moved with the casual confidence of old money, greeting other guests with the kind of understated elegance that came from generations of country clubs and trust funds. They don't know, Margaret realized suddenly. You haven't told them that we paid for all this. Emma's silence was answer enough. You're ashamed of us, Richard said, and it wasn't a question. I'm not ashamed, Emma replied, but her voice lacked conviction. I need to fit in with their world now. You wouldn't understand. Margaret stared at her daughter, this woman she had raised, sacrificed for, loved unconditionally, and saw a stranger. When had Emma become someone who could dismiss the people who had given her everything with such casual cruelty? Mrs. Wilson, the wedding coordinator, approached tentatively. Is everything all right? The ceremony is scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. There's been a change, Emma said before Margaret could respond. My parents won't be attending after all. Could you escort them to the side exit? I don't want them to disturb the arriving guests. The coordinator's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing confusion and something that might have been sympathy. Of course, if that's what you prefer. Margaret looked one last time at her daughter, searching for any sign of regret, any hint that this wasn't what she truly wanted. But Emma had already turned away, her attention focused on smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her gown. Come on, Margaret, Richard said gently, placing a hand on her elbow. Let's go. They walked through the side gardens in silence, past the floral arrangements Margaret had approved, past the photographer setting up for the ceremony that would capture memories they wouldn't be part of. Other guests nodded politely as they passed, unaware they were witnessing the bride's parents leaving their own daughter's wedding. At their car, Margaret finally spoke. 47 years, she said, her voice hollow. 47 years of marriage, 30 years of motherhood, and this is what we get. Richard leaned against the driver's door, his face aged by more than just the harsh afternoon sun. I keep thinking this is a nightmare, that I'll wake up and Emma will be 8 years old again, making us those construction paper Mother's Day cards. Margaret clutched the gift box tighter. The pearl necklace inside seemed to weigh nothing and everything all at once. 3 generations of love and tradition, rejected before it could even be offered. She chose them, Margaret said, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. She chose their approval over our love. Richard opened the car door, but neither of them moved to get in. In the distance, they could hear the string quartet beginning the processional. Emma was walking down the aisle. Without them, what do we do now? Richard asked. Margaret looked at the venue one last time, at the elegant gardens they had walked through countless times during the planning process, at the building where their retirement savings had been transformed into someone else's perfect day. Now we take back our dignity, she said quietly. 6 hours earlier, Margaret had awakened before dawn, her body humming with the particular energy that came from months of careful planning, finally culminating in a single day. Beside her, Richard slept peacefully, his breathing steady and deep. At 68, he still looked like the man she'd married 47 years ago, though silver now threaded through his dark hair and lines mapped the corners of his eyes. She slipped from bed quietly, padding to the kitchen in her slippers to start the coffee. This would be the last morning they woke up as parents of an unmarried daughter. By evening, Emma would be Mrs. Justin Hayward, and they would have gained a son-in-law they still barely knew despite the 8-month engagement. The thought should have filled her with joy. Instead, a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Margaret poured coffee into her favorite mug, a Mother's Day gift from Emma's sophomore year of college, and settled at the kitchen table with her wedding planning folder. Inside were 8 months of careful documentation, vendor contracts, payment receipts, Menu tastings, floral consultations, every detail orchestrated, every expense carefully calculated from Richard's teacher's pension. The final invoice from Riverside Gardens sat on top. $38,000 for venue, catering, flowers, music, and photography. More than they'd spent on their own wedding, their first car, and Emma's first year of college combined. But it was what Emma wanted, and they'd always found a way to give Emma what she wanted. Margaret flipped through the folder, pausing at the photos from Emma's dress fittings. In the earlier pictures, Emma glowed with excitement, spinning in front of the mirror in the simple but elegant gown they'd chosen together. But somewhere around the third fitting, something had changed. Emma had grown distant during the appointments, more critical of the details, less interested in Margaret's opinions. "I think I want to look at some other options," Emma had said during what turned out to be their final shopping trip together. Maybe something with more presence. Margaret had tried to hide her hurt. They'd spent weeks finding the perfect dress, bonding over shared tastes and compromises. But she'd swallowed her feelings, as she always did, and agreed to help Emma find something new. Except Emma never invited her to look for the replacement. The new dress appeared in subsequent photos Emma posted on social media, more elaborate, more expensive, and chosen without Margaret's input. "You're up early," Richard's voice interrupted her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, hair tousled, wearing the old baseball shirt that had become his weekend uniform. "Couldn't sleep," Margaret admitted, gesturing to the folder. "Just reviewing everything one more time." Richard poured himself coffee and sat across from her. For a moment, they shared the comfortable silence that came from nearly 5 decades together. Then Richard reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "She's going to be beautiful today," he said. "She is beautiful," Margaret corrected. "I just wish—" "What?" Margaret struggled to put her feelings into words. "I wish I felt more included in her happiness. Lately, it's like we're vendors providing a service rather than family celebrating with her." Richard squeezed her hand. "Wedding stress. You remember how crazy you were before our wedding? You changed your mind about the flowers 3 times. That was different. My mother was involved in every decision. She held my hand through all of it." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "I thought I'd have that with Emma." "You still might. Today could be different." Margaret wanted to believe him, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The rehearsal dinner invitation that had arrived after they'd already paid for it, addressed formally to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Wilson, the seating chart that placed them at a table with distant relatives rather than close family. The photographer's timeline that included minimal shots with the bride's parents. Small slights, perhaps, but they added up to a pattern Margaret was finally beginning to recognize. The phone rang, jarring them both from their thoughts. Margaret glanced at the caller ID. "Emma, good morning, sweetheart," Margaret answered, injecting warmth into her voice despite her reservations. "Mom, thank God you're up." Emma's voice was tight with stress. "I need you to do something for me. The wedding planner just called. There's an issue with the final head count. Can you call the caterer and confirm we're expecting exactly 127 guests? And make sure they know about the additional dietary restrictions I emailed about yesterday." Margaret hadn't received any email about dietary restrictions, but she didn't mention that. "Of course, honey. Is everything else okay? Fine. Just, you know how these things are. Everyone wants everything perfect." Emma's tone softened slightly. "I should probably ask, are you and Dad planning to give a speech today? We weren't planning on it, but if you'd like us to." "Actually, no, Justin's father is handling all the toasts. It would be weird to have too many speeches, but thanks for understanding." Another exclusion, wrapped in consideration. Margaret felt Richard watching her face, reading the disappointment she was trying to hide. "Of course," Margaret said. "Whatever you prefer." "Great. I have to run. Hair and makeup start in an hour. I'll see you at the venue. Okay? Emma, wait. But the line had already gone dead. Margaret set the phone down slowly, staring at it as if it might explain her daughter's increasing distance. What did she need? Richard asked. Caterer confirmation. And to make sure we don't embarrass her by trying to give a speech. Margaret's voice was steady, but Richard could hear the hurt underneath. Maybe we should talk to her after the wedding, Richard suggested. When things settle down, clear the air about how we've been feeling. Margaret nodded, though part of her wondered if there would be a settling down. Emma and Justin were moving to Denver after their honeymoon, a 6-hour drive from Lakewood. Emma had already mentioned how busy she'd be with her new marketing job and getting settled in their new house, which they'd bought without consulting Margaret and Richard, despite Richard's 40 years of experience in real estate and construction. Another decision made without them, another sign that their opinions were no longer valued or wanted. Margaret closed the wedding folder with a soft thud. I should get ready. Hair appointment is at 10. Want me to drive you? No, I'll take myself. You should relax before we have to get dressed up. In truth, Margaret wanted the solitude. She needed time to prepare herself emotionally for what she was beginning to suspect would be a difficult day. The signs had been accumulating for months, the gradual exclusion from decisions, the formal rather than familial communication, the sense that they were being managed rather than included. At the salon, Margaret tried to shake off her melancholy. This was her daughter's wedding day. Whatever issues existed between them could be addressed later. Today was about celebration, about family, about love. But as she sat under the hairdryer, scrolling through social media, she found Emma's latest post, a photo of the bridal party getting ready, all laughing and holding champagne glasses. The caption read, "Surrounded by my chosen family on the most important day of my life. Hashtag bride squad, hashtag chose family, hashtag wedding day, chosen family." The phrase hit Margaret like a physical blow. Since when was family something you chose rather than something you were born into, raised by, loved unconditionally by? Margaret's phone buzzed with notifications as friends and relatives liked and commented on Emma's post. Her sister Susan had written, "So beautiful, can't wait to see you walk down that aisle." Margaret's own comment, "So proud of you, sweetheart," looked pathetic in comparison, the enthusiasm forced and obvious. She put her phone away and closed her eyes, trying to recapture the joy she'd felt that morning. But doubt had taken root, and it was growing with each passing hour. The silver-wrapped box sat on Margaret's dresser like an accusation, its ribbon perfectly tied despite her trembling. Inside lay 4 generations of Wilson family history. Her great-grandmother's pearl necklace, worn by every Wilson woman on her wedding day since 1924. Margaret lifted the box, feeling its familiar weight. She'd cleaned and polished the antique silver and pearl pendant until it gleamed, imagining the moment she would clasp it around Emma's neck, continuing the tradition that connected them to the women who came before. Almost ready? Richard appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie, the same navy silk he'd worn to Emma's college graduation, their 25th anniversary, and every important occasion in between. "How do I look?" Margaret asked, smoothing the skirt of her pale blue dress. She'd chosen the color carefully, wanting to complement the wedding palette without drawing attention from the bride. "Beautiful as always," Richard said, but she caught him glancing at the box in her hands. "You sure you want to give that to her today? Maybe it would be better as a quiet moment after the ceremony." Margaret had been having the same thought. The necklace was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of continuity, of belonging, of the unbroken chain of love that connected generations of women in their family. It deserved more than a hurried exchange in a crowded bridal suite. "I've been thinking about that too," she admitted. but I keep imagining her face when she sees it. Maybe it will remind her of what family really means. Richard's expression suggested he shared her doubts, but he simply nodded. Whatever you think is best. They drove to Riverside Gardens in comfortable silence, the box resting in Margaret's lap like a talisman. The venue looked magnificent in the afternoon light, gardens in full spring bloom, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, the floral arch they'd selected together, creating a romantic backdrop for the ceremony. It really is beautiful, Richard said as they pulled into the circular drive. It should be, for what we paid, Margaret replied, then immediately regretted the bitterness in her tone. I'm sorry. I'm nervous. We both are. This whole thing has felt strange. Strange was a diplomatic way to put it. The entire engagement had been a series of subtle exclusions and disappointments, each one explained away by wedding stress or busy schedules. Emma's increasing reliance on Justin's family for advice and support, while keeping Margaret and Richard at arm's length, had been particularly painful. Inside the venue, they were greeted by the wedding coordinator, a polished woman named Diana, who managed exclusive events for Colorado's social elite. Margaret had met her only once before, during the initial booking appointment that Emma had scheduled without advance notice. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, so wonderful to see you again. Emma is just finishing with hair and makeup. She asked me to bring you to her when you arrived. They followed Diana through the elegantly appointed building, past other wedding parties and event spaces, to the bridal suite. Margaret's pulse quickened with anticipation. This would be the first time she'd see Emma in her wedding dress, the first real mother-daughter moment they'd shared in weeks. Diana knocked on the door marked with a calligraphy bride sign. Emma, your parents are here. The door opened, and Margaret's breath caught. Emma stood before them in her wedding gown, not the one they'd chosen together, but something entirely different, more elaborate, more expensive, more like something a society bride would wear, rather than the daughter of two retired teachers. Emma looked beautiful, undeniably so. Mom, Dad, Emma said, her voice carefully neutral. You look nice. Nice. Not wonderful or elegant or any of the warm words Margaret had imagined her daughter might use. Just nice. You're breathtaking, Margaret said, and meant it despite her confusion about the dress change. Absolutely breathtaking. Emma's smile was polite but distant. Behind her, Margaret could see the bridesmaids, 5 women she barely knew. Friends Emma had made in Denver through work and social circles. They watched the family reunion with curious expressions, and Margaret felt suddenly self-conscious. I brought you something, Margaret said, lifting the silver box. Something I've been saving for this day since you were born. Emma's